Hello everyone, my name is Victor and today we are going to be discussing about a React hook called useMemo. UseMemo is a React hook that is used to optimize performance in React application. So to begin with, you can see that I have a very simple React application. I am importing useState from React. I am importing these initial users. It's essentially an array. I am importing from this file. We come back to this later. And in the app component, I am creating two pieces of state. I'm creating count, which is a state that is going to start from 0. I am creating users, which is also a state that is going to be holding this array that we're importing. And then I am creating a constant called selected user. And does this selected user going to be holding? It's essentially going to be looping over the array of users that I am just importing and then assigning to the state, and only to find it's using the find. It's an array method that is actually, it loops over an array and then it returns the first element that it reaches, which matches the condition provided. So as you can see, it's accessing each user from users and then it's returning a user where is selected is equal to true. So this is going to be a selected user, and a selected user is only going to be one from this array. So as you can see here in the UI, I am returning a div with a count, which is displaying this state variable, and a selected user, which is also displaying an ID from this selected user constant that we just created. As you can see here, I have another button which is saying increment, and what it does, it's actually incrementing the state count. And if we come back to this file, the initial users, as you can see it, I am exporting a constant which is called initial users. It's essentially an array of almost 9 elements, and I'm just filling all of those elements with 0 and then mapping over them, accessing index, and then for each element I return an object with an ID, which is actually the index, and then the is selected property, which is a boolean value, which is always going to be true for the last element. So if we come to this application, and actually can see here, I'm displaying a simple UI. There's nothing interesting or nothing fancy here, and I'm displaying count. I'm displaying the selected user that I'm just created here, and if I click on the increment, it's just going to add 1 to the count. If I click increment again, it's adding 1 to the count. It's essentially incrementing. So you might ask yourself, what's the performance problems with this application? So I want you to think about this, the way React renders the components. So whenever we create a state, it's going to be given an initial value, and this will not be executed on another render. So whenever we render this component, we are not going to execute this code again. But the problem is happening on this selected user constant. As you can see, I am mapping, or I'm looping over the users array by finding the user which is selected. As you can see here, we saw that this array is a very, very, very large array, and the selected user will be the last one. And this is a performance. This is an expensive operation. It means every time we are updating count with this button, the React is rendering this app component, and which means it's actually calculating the selected user again. It's actually looping over 9 million elements array to actually find the last user which is selected. And you can see that if I come here and press this button so quickly, as you can see, I'm clicking the button, and you can see it's skipping some numbers. And if I click so fast and then I let go, you can see that it just freezes, because this is not a good performant application. So actually, if you can see, it just jumps to 45 and 50. So this is not a good performant application. So I want you to ask yourself, this selected user, it's an expensive operation that we are performing in this application. We are finding a selected user, but I want you to ask yourself one question: do we need to keep finding this user on every render while this user's array didn't change? And the answer is no. So it means when the user's array didn't change, the selected user from the previous render will be the same from the next renders until the users change. So what we might do, what React useMemo hook does, it actually creates a function. It receives two arguments. It receives a function that will perform this expensive operation and returns the value from that function, and then receives the second argument as a dependencies array. And whenever the values in the dependencies array didn't change, useMemo will not execute that function again. So let me show you what I'm saying. If I come here and import useMemo from React, sorry, use memo. And then use memo is actually a hook. I can call it like this, use memo. And then what it takes in, it takes a function, as we just said, and then a dependencies array. So what does this function does? This function actually is the one that executes this expensive operation. I can just put it here and then return. So this function always must return a value, which means the value returned from this function from the first render will be memoized so that this memo will not rerun this function to calculate this value whenever nothing in the dependencies array change. So in the dependencies array here, I'm going to put in users. So it means whenever users didn't change, we will not execute this function again. So what this means, it means that we are going to execute this function on the first render, and then it's going to return an object of a selected user. But whenever, as long as the users array didn't change, we are not executing this function again. So let's see what that does on our application. So if I click on the button, and if I click so fast, you can see that my button is responsive, and as fast as I can click, it's going to respond instantly. So this is actually what useMemo does. So you have to remember that it takes a function and then a dependencies array, and whenever nothing in the dependencies array changed from the previous render, it's going to memorize the value, and it's not going to execute this function again. Actually, because this is a narrow function, I can simplify this syntax by removing this and then removing this again. This should just work. This should work just fine. So as you can see, my button is still responsive, and this is what useMemo does.